At Christmas, I saw my son bring a heavy chest of gold to his mother-in-law and gave me a $10 gift card. The weight of that chest crushed me more than its golden contents ever could. My own flesh and blood had reduced my worth to less than the price of a sandwich. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 73 years old. Every morning for the past 15 years, I've woken before dawn in my cramped studio apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The radiator clanks like old bones, and the thin walls let in every sound from the bustling street below. The faded floral curtains I bought at a thrift store on Amsterdam Avenue flutter weakly against the single window that overlooks a narrow alley where pigeons nest and garbage trucks rumble past at 5 in the morning. I brew weak coffee in a pot I've owned since my son Michael was born 45 years ago. The same pot that once filled our family kitchen with warmth now sits alone on a counter barely wide enough for a cutting board. The apartment smells of mildew and old paper, remnants of decades where I scraped together every dollar, every moment of peace, thinking that sacrifice meant love. That December morning, the one that would change everything, I stood at my small window, watching the city wake up. Steam rose from manholes like ghosts, and I could hear the distant honking of taxis carrying people to families who actually wanted them. I wore the same threadbare navy coat my late husband Robert had bought me 20 years ago, its wool now thin as tissue paper, its buttons hanging by threads I kept promising myself I'd reinforce. I was getting ready for the annual Christmas gathering at St. Matthew's Church on West 84th Street. It's a small, weathered building squeezed between two apartment complexes, where the congregation has dwindled over the years, but the spirit of community still flickers like candles in December wind. I thought, maybe this year, maybe Michael would finally see me, really see me. The church smelled of pine from the modest wreaths volunteers had hung, mixed with the faint scent of coffee brewing in the basement kitchen. I arrived early, as I always did, helping Mrs. Patterson arrange folding chairs and smoothing tablecloths over the long tables where families would share potluck dishes. My contribution was a green bean casserole made with ingredients I'd stretched over 3 meals that week. When Michael finally arrived, my heart jumped the way it had when he was 5 and would run to me after school. But this time, he didn't even glance in my direction. Instead, he grunted under the weight of something extraordinary, an ornate chest that gleamed like captured sunlight. It was wooden, carved with intricate designs, and bound with actual gold fittings that caught the church's modest lighting like stars. The thing was so heavy that Michael's face was red with effort, and his wife Jennifer rushed to guide him toward her mother, Mrs. Bradford. Mrs. Bradford sat in the front row like royalty, her perfectly styled silver hair catching the light, her designer coat worth more than my rent for 3 months. She smiled with satisfaction as Michael placed the chest at her feet with reverence I'd never seen him show anyone, certainly not his own mother. In my trembling hand, I held my gift for him, a $10 gift card to Morningside Deli, the only place I could afford after paying my bills that month. The plastic felt cheap and embarrassing between my fingers, and I quickly tucked it into my worn purse. I watched from across the room as Jennifer embraced her mother, as Michael's children, my grandchildren, gathered around the golden chest with wonder and excitement. I remembered other Christmases before Jennifer, when Michael would at least pretend to care about the scarves I knitted him, or the photo albums I carefully assembled with pictures of his childhood. I remembered the smell of Robert's cologne on Christmas morning, the sound of laughter around our old wooden dining table, the way ribbon curled like spring buds in my palms when I wrapped presents I could actually afford to be proud of. But standing there in that church, watching my son lavish attention on people who already had everything, I felt invisible. Worse than invisible. I felt erased. The pastor called everyone to the fellowship hall, and families moved together in warm clusters of conversation and shared anticipation. I followed behind, always behind, carrying my humble casserole and hoping someone might ask me to sit with them. Michael's family claimed an entire table near the front, the golden chest prominently displayed like a centerpiece. I took a seat 3 tables away, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid the awkward politeness that had become our family's specialty. Have you ever felt like a stranger at your own family gathering? Have you ever watched your child choose other people over you, repeatedly, without explanation or apology? I spent 45 years raising Michael as a single mother after Robert died from a heart attack when our son was just 8. 45 years of working double shifts at the hospital cafeteria, my feet swollen in cheap shoes, my back aching from bending over steam trays and washing endless dishes. 45 years of saying no to myself so I could say yes to him. When Michael wanted to go to college, I took out loans I'm still paying. When he wanted to start his construction business, I emptied my savings account, $23,000 I'd scraped together over decades of skipped meals and postponed medical appointments. When he married Jennifer, I paid for half their honeymoon to Italy, using money I'd saved for my own retirement. Jennifer came from old money, the kind of wealth that builds trust funds and summer homes in the Hamptons. Her father owned a chain of luxury hotels, and her mother had never worked a day in her life. From the moment she entered Michael's life, I felt the shift. Suddenly, my homemade gifts weren't good enough. My modest apartment embarrassed him when Jennifer's friends visited New York. My simple ways of celebrating holidays seemed quaint and insufficient. I remember the first time Jennifer corrected me in front of Michael. It was Thanksgiving, 3 years after they married, and I was telling a story about Michael's childhood, about how he used to collect bottle caps and arrange them by color on our kitchen table. Jennifer laughed, but not with warmth. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You tell that story every year. Maybe it's time for some new memories." Michael said nothing. He didn't defend me or redirect the conversation. He just nodded along, as if agreeing that his childhood, our shared history, was something to be ashamed of. The microaggressions started small and grew like weeds. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Invitations to family dinners dwindled. My grandson Timothy's birthday parties moved from public parks where I could afford to attend to expensive venues, where the admission price alone equaled my grocery budget for a month. When I couldn't afford to attend, Jennifer would sigh dramatically and tell Michael, "Your mother is being difficult again." But I kept trying. I kept sacrificing. When Michael's business hit rough waters 2 years ago, I mortgaged my apartment to loan him $50,000. He promised to pay me back with interest, promised that this investment would secure both our futures. I never saw a penny of that money again, but I watched his business flourish, watched them buy a house in Westchester with a circular driveway and a 3-car garage. My birthday became an afterthought, if it was thought of at all. Last March, I baked my own cake, a simple yellow cake with vanilla frosting, and placed it on my small table, hoping Michael might remember and call. I waited until midnight, then ate a single slice and threw the rest away. The next week, I saw on Jennifer's social media that they'd thrown an elaborate party for her mother's birthday, complete with a jazz band and champagne that cost more per bottle than I spend on food in a month. The forgotten phone calls on Mother's Day, the canceled visits when I was recovering from pneumonia, the Christmas cards that stopped coming, replaced by impersonal texts that felt like obligations rather than expressions of love. Each small rejection carved away another piece of my heart, until I wondered if there was anything left worth loving. But the real shock, the moment that shattered my remaining illusions, came 3 weeks before that Christmas gathering at church. I was organizing my papers, trying to make sense of my finances, when I found a bank statement that had been delivered to my address by mistake. It belonged to Michael's account, and the numbers made my hands shake. A deposit for $75,000, transferred from what I slowly realized was my own mortgage account. But there was more. Regular monthly transfers to Jennifer's family accounts, payments for luxury items I couldn't even pronounce, investment purchases in stocks and cryptocurrency that totaled more than I'd see in 5 years of Social Security benefits. My son, the child I'd raised alone, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, had a fortune at his disposal. Not just comfortable money, but wealth that spoke of careful planning and abundant resources. Money that could have helped me fix my heating, could have paid for the dental work I'd been postponing for 2 years, could have allowed me to live with dignity in my final decades. To me, he gave nothing. To them, he gave everything. That night, I sat in my dark apartment, holding that bank statement like evidence of a crime I couldn't quite name. The thin walls seemed to press closer, and the sounds of the city below felt like the world moving on without me. I let my teacup slip from trembling fingers, and it shattered on the floor like my heart had shattered in my chest. The pieces lay scattered, reflecting the weak light from my single lamp, and I began to cry. Not the gentle tears of sadness, but the harsh, silent sobs of someone who has finally seen the truth. I cried for the 45 years of sacrifice that had bought me nothing but a seat at the back of my own son's life. I cried for the woman who had worked herself to exhaustion believing that love would be reciprocated. I cried for all the dreams I'd deferred, all the chances I'd missed, all the years I'd spent begging for scraps of affection from people who saw me as a burden. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to think the unthinkable. What if I stop? What if I finally say no? What if I stop begging for love from people who have already decided I'm not worth it? That night, I packed away our family photographs in a box I pushed to the back of my closet. I couldn't bear to look at those images of happier times, those lies about family love and shared bonds. I stared at myself in my cracked bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the worn woman looking back. Her hair had gone completely gray. Her skin bore the lines of worry and disappointment, and her eyes held a sadness so deep it seemed permanent. But somewhere in those tired eyes, I saw a flicker of something else, something I hadn't seen in years: anger. And with it, the first seeds of self-respect. The confrontation began the week after I'd seen the bank statement. Michael called, which was unusual enough to make me suspicious. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying that strange patience that had become his default tone with me. "Jennifer's been thinking, and we'd like to take you out to dinner this weekend. Somewhere nice." I felt my heart jump with hope, the way it always did when he offered even the smallest gesture of inclusion. But something new inside me whispered caution. "Why?" I asked. "Why?" he repeated, as if the question itself was unreasonable. "Because you're my mother. Because it's almost Christmas." Does there have to be a reason? But there was a reason. There always was with Michael now. "What do you need?" I asked, surprising myself with the directness. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear his breathing change. "Actually," he said finally, "there is something. Jennifer's parents are looking to invest in some property upstate, and they could use a name on the deed for tax reasons. Someone who qualifies for certain senior benefits. My name. They wanted my name on property I'd never see. For benefits they'd pocket, with risks I'd bear alone." I stared at the phone, understanding blooming like a poisonous flower. This wasn't an invitation to dinner. It was a business proposition disguised as family affection. "I need to think about it," I said. "Think about what?" "Mom, they're offering to include you in a real investment opportunity. This could be good for your future." My future. The future they'd never once asked me about, never once considered when making their own plans. "I said I need to think about it, Michael." His voice sharpened. "Mom, you're making this complicated. It's just paperwork. They're trying to help you." "Help me?" The words came out harder than I'd intended. "Like you helped me when you took the mortgage money and never paid it back?" Another silent, this one colder. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The bank statement, Michael. I saw the deposits. I saw where my money went. That money was a loan, Mom. We discussed this. It was an investment in the family business. An investment that paid dividends to everyone except me." I could hear Jennifer's voice in the background, urgent whispers I couldn't make out but could easily interpret. She was coaching him, telling him what to say to manipulate me back into compliance. "Look," Michael said when he came back to the phone, "you're obviously upset about something, and maybe we should talk about this in person. Come to dinner Saturday, and we'll clear the air." But I was tired of having my air cleared by people who polluted it with lies. "No, Michael. I won't be coming to dinner, and I won't be signing any paperwork." "Mom, don't be..." I hung up the phone. For the first time in my adult life, I hung up on my son. My hands shook, but not with fear. With something that felt dangerously like power. The calls came frequently after that. Michael, frustrated and demanding explanations I didn't owe him. Jennifer, sweet and concerned, wondering if I was having problems and needed to talk to someone professional. Even Michael's children, my grandchildren, were enlisted to call and tell me how much they missed me, how much they wanted me at Christmas dinner, how sad Grandpa Michael seemed. But what they meant was how inconvenient my defiance had become, how my sudden unwillingness to be their reliable source of both money and emotional labor was disrupting their carefully constructed family narrative. Do you recognize this pattern? Do you know what it feels like when the people you love most make you feel guilty for finally standing up for yourself? I found strength in unexpected places. Mrs. Rodriguez, my neighbor across the hall, noticed me crying in the laundry room and invited me for coffee. Her small apartment smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread, and her warmth felt like sunshine after months of cold shadows. "Mija," she said, using the Spanish endearment that felt more loving than anything I'd heard from my own family in years. "You cannot pour from an empty cup. Family that drains you is not family. Family that loves you fills your cup too." Her words settled into my heart like seeds in fertile soil. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I went to the library on 79th Street and checked out books about financial independence for seniors. I researched support groups for family caregivers who felt exploited. I learned that my experiences had names: financial abuse, emotional manipulation, scapegoating. I wasn't losing my mind. I was finally finding it. My grandson Timothy surprised me one cold afternoon in early December. He knocked on my door, and when I opened it, his young face was serious in a way that reminded me of Michael at his age. "Grandma Eleanor," he said, "I heard what happened, about the dinner and the phone calls." I invited him in, offered him hot chocolate, watched him look around my small apartment with new eyes. He was 16 now, old enough to understand family politics, old enough to see manipulation when it was happening in front of him. "They're not being fair to you," he said quietly. Mom and Dad talk about you like you're being unreasonable. But I remember all the things you did for us. I remember when Dad couldn't afford my baseball equipment and you bought it. I remember when Mom wanted that expensive stroller for Emma, and you paid for it even though you took the bus for 2 months afterward because you couldn't afford MetroCard. The validation from this young man who carried my genetic legacy felt like absolution. He saw what others chose to ignore. He remembered what others had conveniently forgotten. I don't expect them to take care of me, I told him. I just want them to stop taking advantage of me. That's not unreasonable, Grandma. That's basic respect. Basic respect. Such a simple concept, yet so elusive in my own family relationships. Timothy hugged me before he left and whispered, "I love you for who you are, not for what you can give me." Those words sustained me through the hardest decision I'd ever made. I called Michael the next day and told him I wouldn't be joining the family for Christmas Eve dinner. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. "What do you mean you're not coming?" he asked finally. "I mean I'm making other plans. Mom, this is Christmas. Family Christmas. You can't just not come." "I can't?" The question came out more challenged than I'd intended. "Michael, when was the last time you asked what I wanted for Christmas? When was the last time you asked what I needed, what I was struggling with, how I was feeling about anything at all? We talk all the time. You call when you need something." "That's not the same as talking." I could hear Jennifer in the background again, her voice sharp with urgency. The conversation was not going according to their script. "Fine," Michael said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "If you want to be stubborn and ruin Christmas for everyone, that's your choice. But don't expect us to keep reaching out if you're going to be difficult." The threat was clear: submit or be abandoned. Choose compliance or choose loneliness. It was the same ultimatum he'd been giving me for years, wrapped in different packaging but always carrying the same message. For the first time, I chose loneliness. And surprisingly, it felt like freedom. Christmas Eve morning, I woke up in my small apartment and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. No frantic cooking, no wrapping gifts I couldn't afford, no anxiety about whether my presence would be welcomed or merely tolerated. I made coffee, real coffee from beans I'd splurged on at Zabar's, and sat by my window watching snow fall on the city streets below. I called Mrs. Rodriguez and asked if she'd like to spend the evening together. She invited me to her nephew's house in Queens, where 3 generations of family welcomed me like I belonged. The apartment was crowded and loud, filled with children's laughter and the smell of homemade tamales. Nobody asked me for money or favors or emotional labor. They just included me in their celebration because kindness was their family's tradition. That night, for the first time in years, I felt like I was where I belonged. But the real test came afterward. The phone calls from Michael, increasingly angry, demanding to know where I'd been and who I'd been with. Jennifer, alternating between fake concern and barely concealed hostility, suggesting I was going through something and needed professional help. Extended family members, recruited as flying monkeys, calling to tell me how hurt and confused Michael was by my behavior. "He's your son," my sister Martha said during one particularly manipulative call. "He's trying to build a good life for his family. Why can't you just be supportive?" "I've been supportive for 45 years, I replied. "When does he start supporting me?" "That's not how families work, Eleanor. Parents give to their children. That's natural. And what do children give to their parents?" The silence told me everything I needed to know about her answer. The weeks after Christmas brought a campaign of emotional terrorism designed to break my resolve. Michael would drive by my building, calling from his car to tell me he was in the neighborhood and wanted to work things out. Jennifer sent flowers with cards that read, "We miss you," and "Family is everything." The grandchildren were deployed with increasing frequency, their young voices delivering carefully coached messages about how sad the house felt without Grandma. But the worst came in late January, when I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. I was at the grocery store on Broadway, moving slowly through the aisles with my small cart, when I heard familiar voices in the next row. Jennifer and her mother, Mrs. Bradford, talking in the confident tones of people who believe themselves to be alone. "She's becoming a real problem," Jennifer was saying. "Michael is starting to feel guilty, and guilt makes him unpredictable with money." "What exactly does she want?" Mrs. Bradford asked. "Recognition, I think. She wants to feel important. It's pathetic, really. We've given her a place in our lives, but it's not enough. She wants to be central, like she was when Michael was a child." "Well, that's obviously impossible. Michael has a real family now. A real family." The words hit like a physical blow, but I stayed hidden behind the cereal boxes, needing to hear more. "The problem is the grandchildren," Jennifer continued. "Timothy especially. He's starting to ask questions about why we don't include her more. Last week, he asked Michael why Grandma Eleanor lives in a tiny apartment when we have so much space. Children don't understand complex family dynamics. No, but they understand fairness, and that's problematic. If she would just accept her role and stop making demands, everything would be fine. But she's getting ideas about being treated like an equal partner in family decisions. An equal partner. In my own son's life, the audacity of wanting basic respect was being discussed like a character flaw, a psychological deficiency that needed to be managed. Maybe it's time to be more direct, Mrs. Bradford suggested. Set clear boundaries about what her role is and what it isn't. Give her a choice. Accept the relationship as it exists or forfeit it entirely. Michael won't go that far. He still has some residual attachment. Residual attachment. Like love was a tumor that needed to be excised for the health of the patient. I stood in that grocery store, surrounded by the mundane choices of breakfast cereals and coffee brands, listening to my family plan my emotional exile with the casual efficiency of corporate executives discussing budget cuts. The fluorescent lights felt harsh and revealing, illuminating not just the products on the shelves, but the stark reality of my position in their lives. I left my cart in the aisle and walked home in the January cold, my thin coat inadequate against both the weather and the chill in my heart. But something was different this time. The overheard conversation hadn't crushed me. It had clarified something essential. This was never going to get better. No amount of compliance would earn their respect. No degree of sacrifice would purchase their love. I was free to stop trying. That night, I did something I hadn't done since Robert died 25 years earlier. I made a plan for my own life that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or expectations. I researched senior community centers in Manhattan. I looked into part-time work that might supplement my Social Security and give me purpose beyond being someone's emotional and financial resource. I contacted a financial advisor to understand what options I had for my remaining years. I made a list of things I'd always wanted to do but had postponed for decades while serving other people's priorities. The list was longer than I'd expected. Painting classes, a trip to see the Grand Canyon, learning to play piano, reading all the books I'd bought but never had time to enjoy, volunteering at the animal shelter, taking the writing workshop at the community college. Simple things, but they felt revolutionary. They were mine. They belonged to me, not to some family dynamic that required my diminishment for others' comfort. I started small. I signed up for a watercolor class at the YMCA on 92nd Street. Walking into that classroom full of easels and paint-stained tables felt like entering a different world, one where I existed as myself, rather than as someone's mother or grandmother or source of emergency funds. The instructor, a patient woman named Carol with silver hair and paint under her fingernails, handed me a brush and said, "Don't worry about being good, just worry about being present." Being present. What a concept. I'd spent so many years being absent from my own life, focused entirely on other people's needs and dreams, that I'd forgotten what presence felt like. My first painting was terrible, a muddy landscape that bore no resemblance to the photograph I was copying, but it was mine. The colors I'd chosen, the strokes I'd made, the time I'd spent creating something rather than sacrificing something. When I held it up, still wet with possibility, I felt proud for the first time in years. The woman painting next to me, an elegant lady named Frances who must have been in her 80s, smiled and said, "First painting? First everything," I replied, and we both laughed. Frances became my first new friend in decades. Over coffee after class, she told me about her own journey of late-life independence. Her adult children lived across the country and visited rarely, but she'd built a life so rich and varied that their absence felt like their loss, not hers. "The secret," she said, stirring honey into her tea, "is becoming interested in your own story again. We spend so many years being supporting characters in other people's narratives that we forget we're the protagonists of our own lives." Protagonist. I turned the word over in my mind like a found treasure. When was the last time I'd been the protagonist of anything? But change, real change, isn't just about new activities and perspectives. It requires confronting the systems that have held you down, and that meant dealing with my family's response to my growing independence. The phone calls became more aggressive. Michael, frustrated by my refusal to return to our old dynamic, started making demands rather than requests. He needed me to co-sign a loan for a business expansion. He needed me to watch the children for a week while he and Jennifer took a vacation to Europe. Unpaid labor presented as a privilege. When I said no to the co-signing, he accused me of sabotaging his success out of jealousy. When I said no to the free childcare, Jennifer called to ask if I was becoming one of those bitter old women who turn against their families. But the most telling response came from Mrs. Bradford, who called me directly for the first time in 5 years. "Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I understand you're going through something, but this behavior is affecting my daughter's family stability. Your daughter's family stability? Michael is distracted at work. Jennifer is stressed about family dynamics. The children are confused about why their grandmother has become unavailable. This selfishness has consequences beyond just yourself. Selfishness, the word that had been used to control me my entire adult life. Any assertion of my own needs, any boundary I tried to establish, any request for reciprocal consideration, selfishness. Mrs. Bradford, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. For 45 years, I've put my son's needs above my own. I've given him money I couldn't afford to lose, time I couldn't afford to spare, and emotional energy I needed for my own survival. If taking care of myself for the first time in decades is selfishness, then I'm proud to be selfish. That attitude will leave you very alone. I'm already alone. The difference is that now I'm chosen to be. The line went quiet. Then she said, "You'll regret this, Eleanor. Family is all we have in the end. Family is what we build with love and respect." What I had was an unpaid job with people who shared my DNA. I hung up the phone and felt something shift inside my chest, like a door that had been stuck for years finally swinging open. But Mrs. Bradford was wrong about one thing. I wouldn't be alone. I was building something new, something I'd never had before. A chosen family of people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. Timothy started visiting me regularly, drawn by the changes he saw in me. Instead of the tired, anxious woman who'd tried to buy his love with gifts she couldn't afford, he found someone who was learning to paint, taking evening walks along the Hudson River, reading novels that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs. "You seem different, Grandma," he said one afternoon as we walked through Riverside Park. "Happier, I think." "I'm learning to be interested in my own life," I told him, borrowing Frances's words. "Is that why you don't come around anymore?" It was a fair question from a 16-year-old trying to understand adult complexities. "Timothy, I love you and Emma more than you'll ever know, but the way your parents treated me was hurting me, and I had to choose between being hurt all the time or being absent some of the time." He nodded slowly. "They talk about you like you're being unreasonable, but I remember how you used to look after their phone calls, like someone had said something mean to you. Children see so much more than adults give them credit for. They notice patterns, inconsistencies, the gap between public faces and private realities. Your parents aren't bad people," I said carefully, "but they learned to see me as a resource rather than a person, and I taught them that by always being available no matter how they treated me. So now you're teaching them something different?" "I'm teaching myself something different. I'm learning that love without respect isn't really love." Spring came early that year, and with it, a test I hadn't anticipated. Michael called in March with news that Jennifer was pregnant with their third child. His voice carried that edge of excitement and anxiety that comes with expanding families and increasing financial pressures. "Mom," he said, "this changes things for us. We're going to need more help, especially in the first few months after the baby arrives." More help. Not, "Would you like to be involved?" or "We'd love your support." Just the assumption that my time and energy belonged to them by right of relationship. "Congratulations," I said. "I'm happy for you both. So you'll help? Jennifer's mother has offered to pay for a nanny, but we thought you'd want to be the one taking care of your grandchild." The manipulation was elegant in its simplicity. Present my participation as competing with hired help, make it seem like I was being offered a privilege rather than asked to provide free labor, and imply that refusing would mean I didn't want to care for my own grandchild. "I'd be happy to visit regularly," I said, "to build a relationship with the baby, but I won't be providing childcare." "What do you mean you won't be providing childcare? You're retired. What else do you have to do? What else do I have to do?" As if my life was an empty vessel waiting to be filled with their needs. "I have my own life now, Michael. Classes, friends, activities. I'm not available to be your unpaid nanny. But this is family. This is your grandchild. And I'll be a wonderful grandmother." But grandmothers and nannies aren't the same thing. The conversation ended with Michael frustrated and me strangely calm. I'd expected to feel guilty, but instead I felt proud. I was learning to love without sacrificing myself, to be family without being taken for granted. But challenges to new boundaries often escalate before they resolve. 2 weeks later, Jennifer called, her voice thick with tears and carefully orchestrated emotion. "Eleanor," she said, "I need to be honest with you. This pregnancy has been difficult, and I'm struggling. Michael works such long hours, and the kids need so much attention. I know we've had our differences, but I'm hoping you might reconsider helping us." It was a masterful performance. The vulnerability, the direct appeal, the acknowledgement of past differences without any actual accountability. If I said no to this tearful request for help during a difficult pregnancy, I would be the monster who abandoned a struggling mother. Jennifer, I said gently, I hear that you're having a hard time, and I'm sorry about that. What kind of help are you looking for? Just someone who could be here during the day. Help with meals, light cleaning, watch Timothy and Emma when they get home from school. Nothing major. Nothing major. 40 hours a week of domestic labor, presented as a small favor between family members. And Michael would pay me for this help? The silence stretched long enough to answer my question. Well, it's not really about money, is it? It's about family supporting family. Jennifer, when your mother helps you, does she do it for free? That's different. She has other resources. So do you. You just said she offered to pay for a nanny. Hire the nanny. But we want family involved. We want the kids to have a relationship with their grandmother. They can have a relationship with me without me being your employee. The tears stopped, replaced by something colder. I don't understand why you're being so selfish about this. When I was growing up, grandparents were honored to help with grandchildren. When you were growing up, grandparents were also respected and included in family decisions. They weren't just called when free labor was needed. That's not fair. You're right, it hasn't been fair. But it's going to be now. After I hung up, I sat in my small living room looking at the paintings I'd completed in my watercolor class. They weren't museum quality, but they were mine. Evidence of time I'd spent nurturing my own growth instead of sacrificing myself for people who saw my sacrifice as their due. The campaign intensified after that conversation. Michael's calls became shorter and more businesslike, focused on specific requests rather than relationship building. Extended family members were enlisted to apply pressure. Cousins and aunts who called to express concern about the division in our family, always with the implication that I was the one creating problems by refusing to return to my old role. But the most painful manipulation came through the children. Timothy and Emma were coached to make specific requests during their visits, always presented as innocent desires but clearly orchestrated by their parents. Grandma Eleanor, 8-year-old Emma said during one visit, Mommy said you don't want to help with the new baby. That's not true, sweetheart. I want to visit the baby and be part of their life, but I won't be working as a babysitter. What's the difference? How do you explain complex family dynamics to a child? How do you communicate that love and service aren't the same thing? That boundaries aren't rejection? The difference is that babysitters get paid, and they get to go home when their work is done. Being a grandmother means I get to love you and play with you and teach you things, but your parents are responsible for taking care of you. She nodded solemnly, processing this information with the gravity children bring to adult problems they sense but don't fully understand. Are you mad at Mommy and Daddy? No, honey, I'm not mad. I'm just learning to take care of myself the way I took care of everyone else. But the real test, the moment that would prove whether my transformation was genuine or just temporary rebellion, came in the form of a family emergency that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Jennifer's difficult pregnancy became a medical crisis in her 7th month. Severe preeclampsia that required immediate hospitalization and bed rest. The baby would need to be delivered early, and the recovery would be long and uncertain. Michael called me from the hospital, his voice cracking with stress and genuine fear. Mom, he said, I need you. I know things have been difficult between us, but Jennifer is really sick, and the doctors don't know if the baby will be okay. I can't handle everything alone. This was different. Not a request for free labor or convenient childcare, but an actual emergency where family support might mean the difference between crisis and catastrophe. What do you need? I asked. Can you take the kids for a few weeks? Just until we know what's happening with Jennifer and the baby? Taking the children meant leaving my apartment, disrupting my classes, putting my new life on hold to serve their emergency. It was exactly the kind of situation where my old patterns would have kicked in automatically. Drop everything, sacrifice anything, prove my worth through service. But I'd learned something important in the past few months. Love doesn't require self-abandonment. Support doesn't require martyrdom. I'll take the children, I said, but here are my conditions. I'll stay at your house so they can keep their routine. You'll pay for groceries and any expenses that come up. And when the crisis is over, we're going to have a conversation about our relationship going forward. Michael was too desperate to argue with conditions. He agreed immediately, and I found myself packing a bag for the first extended stay in their Westchester house since Jennifer had made it clear years ago that my presence there was more tolerated than welcomed. The house was beautiful in the way that money makes things beautiful. Marble countertops, stainless steel appliances, furniture that looked expensive but felt cold. The refrigerator was covered with Emma's artwork and Timothy's honor roll certificates, evidence of lives lived in comfort and abundance. Taking care of Timothy and Emma during those weeks was both exhausting and revealing. They were good kids, but they'd been raised with expectations of constant entertainment and immediate gratification that required enormous emotional energy to manage. Every meal, every bedtime, every transition required negotiation and explanation. But more telling was what I learned about their family dynamics. Timothy, at 16, had already been trained to see his role as mediating between adult conflicts and managing his mother's emotional states. Emma, at 8, had learned to read adult moods with the precision of someone whose safety depended on it. "Is Mommy going to die?" Emma asked me one night as I tucked her into her pink and purple bedroom that cost more to decorate than I spent on rent in 6 months. "The doctors are taking very good care of Mommy and the baby," I said. "She's going to be fine. She was crying a lot before she went to the hospital. Daddy said she was stressed about money. Stressed about money. In a house with 3 luxury cars and a wine cellar, with bank accounts I'd seen evidence of containing more than most people earn in a lifetime. Sometimes adults worry about things even when there's no real danger," I said. "That's not your job to fix." But Timothy said we need to be extra good so we don't make things worse. Children learning to manage adult emotions, to suppress their own needs to maintain family stability. I recognized the pattern because I'd lived it myself. Decades of making myself smaller so other people could feel more comfortable. The baby was born healthy after 3 weeks in the hospital. A beautiful girl they named Sophie. Jennifer's recovery was slow but complete, and gradually the crisis atmosphere in the house began to ease. Michael's desperation softened back into his usual assumption that my help would continue indefinitely. "Mom," he said one evening as we watched the sunset from their back deck, "I want you to know how much this has meant to us. Having you here, taking care of the kids. It's reminded me why family is so important. I'm glad I could help during the emergency," I said. "Well, with the new baby and Jennifer still recovering, we're hoping you might consider staying longer. Maybe permanently. We could fix up the basement apartment, give you your own space, but still be close enough to help with the kids. The basement apartment, a subterranean existence where I could be available for their needs while remaining invisible to their social life, close enough to provide services, far enough away to avoid inconveniencing their real family dynamic." "That's a generous offer," I said, "but I have my own life to get back to." "What life? That tiny apartment in Manhattan? Those painting classes? Mom, this is your family. This is where you belong. Where I belonged. In the basement, available for emergencies, grateful for inclusion, careful not to disrupt the hierarchy that kept me useful, but not central." "Michael," I said, "I love you and I love your children, but my place is not in your basement waiting to be needed. I don't understand why you're being so stubborn about this. We're offering you a place in our home. You're offering me a job with room and board. That's different than offering me a place in your family." The conversation ended with familiar frustration on his part and calm certainty on mine. I would finish out the week, ensuring Jennifer felt strong enough to manage with hired help, and then I would return to Manhattan and my small apartment and my painting classes and my chosen life. But before I left, I had one more conversation that I'd been avoiding for years. I asked Michael to sit with me in his living room after the children were in bed, with the evening news playing softly in the background and the house settling into its nighttime quiet. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to just listen." He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his leather recliner like a teenager about to be lectured by the principal. "For 45 years, I made you the center of my life. I worked jobs I hated to pay for things you wanted. I went without things I needed so you could have things you wanted. I organized my entire existence around your happiness and success." "Mom, please let me finish. I did all of that because I love you, and because I thought that's what good mothers do. But somewhere along the way, you learned to see my sacrifice as your right rather than my gift. You learned to expect my money without gratitude, my time without reciprocation, my labor without payment. That's not true. Michael, you've borrowed over $75,000 from me in the past 5 years. How much have you paid back?" The silence answered my question. "You've asked me to provide childcare, house sitting, emergency services, financial backing, emotional support, and crisis management. What have you offered me in return?" "I've offered you a place in our family." "No, you've offered me a role in serving your family. Those aren't the same thing." I could see him struggling to process this distinction, his face cycling through confusion, defensiveness, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "I'm not angry with you," I continued. "I taught you to treat me this way by always saying yes, always being available, always prioritizing your needs over my own. But I can't teach you something different now by changing how I respond. So what do you want from me? I want a relationship with you that's based on mutual respect rather than my usefulness. I want conversations that include questions about my life, not just updates about your needs. I want to be invited to family events because you enjoy my company, not because you need free labor. And if I can't give you that? The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a recently extinguished fire. Then I'll love you from a distance, I said. I'll always be your mother, but I won't always be your resource. Michael looked out the window at his perfectly manicured yard, his expensive cars in the circular driveway, the material evidence of his success. When he looked back at me, his eyes held something I'd rarely seen from him, vulnerability. I don't know how to do that, he said quietly. The respect thing. I don't think I know how to see you as separate from what you do for me. It was the first honest thing he'd said to me in years. Then maybe you should figure that out, I said, because I'm not going back to the way things were. I left their house the next morning with hugs from the children and polite goodbyes from Michael and Jennifer. Timothy walked me to my taxi, carrying my small suitcase with the careful attention of someone who understands the weight of significant moments. Are you going to be okay, Grandma? He asked. I'm going to be fine, I said. Better than fine. And are we going to see you? Of course. But it might look different than it used to. He nodded solemnly, then hugged me with the fierce affection of a young person who recognizes authenticity when he sees it. The ride back to Manhattan felt like traveling between two different worlds. The suburban abundance of Westchester, with its oversized houses and perfect lawns, gave way to the crowded vitality of the city, where people lived closer together but somehow more honestly. My small apartment welcomed me like an old friend. The radiator's familiar clank, the thin walls that let in the sounds of life happening all around me, the single window that framed a narrow slice of sky, it all felt precious rather than inadequate. I unpacked my bag and found the small watercolor set I'd brought to Westchester but never used. That afternoon, I sat by my window and painted the view. Not the narrow alley and fire escapes, but the slice of blue sky visible between buildings, the play of light and shadow on brick walls, the promise of space and freedom that exists even in confined places. Spring became summer, and my new life developed rhythms that belonged entirely to me. Watercolor classes twice a week, where I was learning to trust my instincts about color and composition. Evening walks along the Hudson River, where the setting sun turned the water into liquid gold. Volunteer work at the animal shelter on weekends, where my gentle touch with anxious dogs earned appreciation that had nothing to do with money or obligation. Francis and I became close friends, meeting regularly for coffee and conversation that ranged from art techniques to philosophical discussions about aging, independence, and the courage required to reinvent yourself in your 70s. She introduced me to her book club, a group of women who'd all navigated their own late-life transformations and understood the particular challenges of establishing boundaries with adult children. The hardest part, said Margaret, a retired teacher whose son had expected her to fund his series of failed business ventures, is accepting that some relationships can't survive honesty. But the ones that do survive become so much stronger, added Carol, who'd learned to say no to her daughter's demands for free childcare and discovered that mutual respect was possible between generations. Timothy visited regularly, taking the train down from Westchester to spend afternoons with me in Manhattan. We'd walk through Central Park or visit museums, having conversations that revealed the thoughtful, complicated person he was becoming. He never asked me for anything except my time and attention, and he offered the same in return. Dad's been different since you left, he told me during one visit. More stressed, but also more, I don't know, more aware that things aren't automatic. What do you mean? Like, he's had to figure out how to handle stuff he used to call you about. And Mom's been talking about hiring help instead of expecting family to do everything for free. Progress, perhaps. Or at least the beginning of recognition that family labor has value and shouldn't be taken for granted. Michael and I settled into a careful truce over the summer. Phone calls became less frequent but more genuine, focused on sharing news rather than requesting services. He told me about Sophie's first smiles, about Timothy's summer job at a local bookstore, about Jennifer's gradual recovery and return to her full energy. I told him about my painting, about the book club, about the trip to Boston I was planning to visit a college friend I hadn't seen in 20 years. Small details of a life that was finally my own. But the real test of our change dynamic came in August, when Michael called with news that felt like a familiar trap. "Mom," he said, "Jennifer's parents are celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary, and they're throwing a big party. The whole family's going to be there, including her extended family from California. We'd really like you to come." I felt the old patterns trying to reestablish themselves, the desire to be included, the fear of missing family events. the worry that saying no would confirm their narrative about my selfishness and difficult behavior. What role would I have at this party? I asked. Role? You'd be there, as part of the family. Michael, the last time you invited me to something with Jennifer's family, you asked me to help with serving and cleanup while her relatives enjoyed themselves as guests. The silence confirmed that he remembered the same event I did. This would be different, he said. Different how? Well, you'd be seated with family at dinner, and we wouldn't ask you to help with anything. It was progress, but it was also revealing. The fact that being treated as a guest rather than hired help required special negotiation demonstrated how far our relationship had fallen from basic respect. I'll think about it, I said. What's to think about? It's a family celebration. It's Jennifer's family celebration. I need to consider whether I'm being invited because you want me there or because it would look strange if I weren't. The distinction mattered. I'd spent years attending events where my presence was required for appearances, but not genuinely welcomed. I was tired of being someone's obligation. I called Timothy that evening and asked for his perspective, trusting his 16-year-old honesty to cut through the adult politeness that obscured real intentions. Honestly, Grandma, I think Dad wants you there, but Mom sees it more like checking a box. Like, we invited Michael's mother, so we can't be accused of excluding her. And what do you think I should do? I think you should come if you want to see us and skip it if you don't want to deal with the Bradford family dynamics. Either way is fine. Such simple wisdom. Attend events because you want to, not because you're obligated to. Prioritize your own comfort over other people's expectations. I decided to attend the anniversary party, but with clear boundaries. I would drive myself rather than depend on Michael for transportation. I would stay in a nearby hotel rather than accept their offer of a guest room where I might be expected to help with party preparations. I would participate as a guest, not as family labor. The party was held at an elegant country club in Connecticut, the kind of venue that required advanced planning and substantial financial resources. Women wore cocktail dresses and expensive jewelry. Men sported golf tans and country club ease. The Bradford family moved through this environment like they'd been born to it, which of course they had. I wore my best dress, navy blue with small pearl buttons, purchased for Robert's funeral 25 years earlier but still elegant, and felt simultaneously overdressed and underdressed for the occasion. Not quite shabby enough to be dismissed, not quite polished enough to belong. During the cocktail hour, I stood near the bar nursing a single glass of wine and watching the family interactions with new eyes. Mrs. Bradford held court like royalty, accepting congratulations and compliments with the gracious entitlement of someone who'd never questioned her right to be the center of attention. Mr. Bradford worked the room like the successful businessman he was, shaking hands and making connections with the practiced ease of someone who understood social events as networking opportunities. Michael moved between groups, playing the role of successful son-in-law with visible pride. Jennifer, still recovering her full energy after Sophie's birth, stayed close to her mother, accepting help and attention with the comfortable expectation of someone who'd always been cared for. I watched Timothy navigate the adult conversations with social skills beyond his years, and Emma charm relatives with precocious observations about grown-up behavior. My grandchildren were being raised to operate in this world of abundance and expectation, learning to see luxury as normal and service as something other people provide. During dinner, I was seated at the family table as promised, between Timothy and one of Jennifer's aunts who made polite conversation about my life in Manhattan. The food was excellent, the service professional, the speeches appropriately sentimental about enduring love and family loyalty. But I found myself studying the dynamics with the detached interest of an anthropologist observing an unfamiliar culture. The casual way Jennifer's family discussed their investments, their travel plans, their children's private school achievements, the assumption that financial security was a given rather than a constant concern, the expectation that family members would prioritize gatherings like this, regardless of personal cost or convenience. It wasn't that they were bad people. They were simply people who'd never had to question whether they mattered, never had to prove their worth through sacrifice, never had to choose between their own needs and their family's expectations. After dinner, as guests migrated to the terrace for coffee and continued conversation, Mrs. Bradford approached me with the measured smile of someone fulfilling a social obligation. "Eleanor," she said, "it's lovely that you could join us tonight. Michael tells me you're taking art classes." "Watercolor painting," I confirmed. "I'm enjoying it very much." "How nice. It's important for seniors to have hobbies." Hobbies. As if creative expression was a way to pass time rather than a source of personal growth and satisfaction. As if my interests mattered only insofar as they kept me occupied and out of the way. "And you're living independently in the city? That must be challenging at your age." I'm 73, not 93. And I love city life. There's so much culture and energy. Of course, though I imagine it gets expensive. The cost of living in Manhattan is just astronomical. It was a delicate probe, the kind of question designed to gather information about my financial situation while maintaining plausible social concern. I recognized it because I'd been on the receiving end of similar inquiries for years. I manage fine, I said simply. Well, it's wonderful that Michael is doing so well with his business. Success allows families to take care of each other. The implication was clear. Successful family members support unsuccessful ones. And my modest circumstances placed me in the category of dependents rather than equals. Michael has built something impressive, I agreed. I'm proud of his hard work and smart decisions. Yes, and Jennifer's been such a good influence on him. She's helped him understand the importance of planning for the future, of building wealth that can benefit the next generation. Building wealth that can benefit the next generation, not building wealth that honors the previous generation or acknowledges the sacrifices that made success possible. The family money flowed in one direction only, forward, toward the future, away from the past. Our conversation was interrupted by Michael approaching with Sophie in his arms, her tiny face peaceful in sleep despite the party noise around us. "Mom," he said, "would you like to hold her?" I took my newest granddaughter carefully, feeling her slight weight settle against my chest. She was beautiful in the way all babies are, but also in ways specific to her. Jennifer's delicate features, Michael's dark hair, eyes that would probably change color, but for now reflected the soft light of the terrace. "She's perfect," I said, and meant it. "Jennifer and I were talking," Michael said, his voice carrying that careful tone that preceded requests, "and we're hoping you might consider moving closer. Not necessarily living with us, but maybe somewhere in Westchester. The kids would love to see more of you, and we could help you find a nice place." A nice place. Code for something affordable but respectable, where I could be available for their needs without the inconvenience of city distance. "I love my life in Manhattan," I said, still holding Sophie but meeting Michael's eyes directly. "I've built friendships and activities that matter to me. I wouldn't want to start over in the suburbs. But think about what you could build here. Real relationships with your grandchildren, quality time with family, real relationships. As if my current life were somehow artificial or insufficient, as if proximity to them was the only path to meaningful connection." "Michael," I said gently, "I have real relationships with Timothy and Emma, and I'll build one with Sophie. But those relationships don't require me to rearrange my entire life around your location preferences." Mrs. Bradford, who had been listening to this exchange with obvious interest, cleared her throat delicately. "Parents do make sacrifices for their children's happiness," she said, "and grandparents traditionally want to be close to grandchildren." "Yes," I said. "I made sacrifices for my child's happiness for 45 years. Now I'm learning to make choices that honor both my love for my family and my responsibility to myself." The conversation ended there, but I could feel the subtle shift in atmosphere. I'd refused their reasonable request, rejected their generous offer, chosen my own preferences over their family vision. Later that evening, as I drove back to my hotel in Connecticut, I reflected on the party and my place in Michael's expanding family network. I'd been included, as promised, but not integrated. I'd been treated politely, but not warmly. I'd been acknowledged as family, but not embraced as belonging. And for the first time, that felt acceptable rather than tragic. The next morning, before driving back to Manhattan, I called Timothy and asked if he'd like to have breakfast. We met at a small diner near his house, the kind of place that served real pancakes and strong coffee without apology or pretension. "How did you think last night went?" I asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all our conversations. "I think it went fine. Everyone was polite, but I could tell the grandparents were trying to figure out how to manage you." "What do you mean, manage me?" "Like, how to get you to do what they want without making it obvious that's what they're doing. The moving to Westchester thing, for example." Such clarity from someone still a teenager. He'd identified the dynamic I'd felt but hadn't fully articulated. "And what do you think about the moving to Westchester thing?" "I think it would be awesome to see you more often. But I also think you seem happier now than you did before, when you were always stressed about money and whether Dad was mad at you about something. You noticed that?" "Grandma, I live in this family. I notice everything." We finished breakfast and hugged goodbye in the parking lot. As I drove back to the city, I thought about Timothy's observation about my happiness. He was right. Despite the ongoing tensions with Michael and Jennifer, despite the financial struggles and the small apartment and the uncertain future, I was happier than I'd been in decades. Happiness, I'd learned, wasn't about having everything you wanted. It was about wanting what you had and refusing to sacrifice your authentic self for other people's comfort. Autumn brought changes that tested my new equilibrium in unexpected ways. Frances, my dear friend and mentor in late-life independence, was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. Her treatment would require surgery and chemotherapy, and she asked if I might be willing to help during her recovery. The request felt familiar, someone needing my time and energy to navigate a health crisis. But this time, the dynamic was different. Frances offered to pay me for any help I provided. She gave me complete information about what she needed and for how long. She presented her request as one friend asking another for assistance that would be genuinely appreciated rather than taken for granted. "I know you've had experiences with people expecting too much from you," she said as we sat in her apartment planning for her surgery. "I want to be clear that this is me asking for help, not assuming I'm entitled to it." The distinction mattered enormously. I agreed to help Frances not because I felt obligated or guilty, but because I cared about her and wanted to support her recovery. The help I provided came from choice rather than compulsion, and it felt entirely different as a result. Caring for Frances during her chemotherapy treatments reminded me that service could be an expression of love, rather than a demonstration of worthlessness. When I drove her to medical appointments or prepared meals for her weakened appetite, I was giving from abundance rather than emptiness. But perhaps more importantly, Frances reciprocated in ways my family never had. She asked about my day, remembered details about my painting classes, expressed genuine interest in my thoughts and feelings. Even while managing cancer treatment, she maintained awareness that I existed as a separate person with my own needs and experiences. "You know what I realized?" she said one afternoon as I helped her organize her medications. "I spent 20 years of my retirement being available to my children whenever they needed me, but they never once asked if I needed them. Do you regret the help you gave them? I regret the way I gave it. Like it wasn't valuable because it was free. Like my time mattered less than theirs because I was retired and they were busy with careers and families." It was a perspective that resonated deeply. Not the giving itself, but the context in which the giving occurred. The assumption that retired parents were resources rather than people, available rather than busy, grateful for inclusion rather than deserving of respect. Michael called one evening in October while I was reading in my small apartment, the radiator providing its familiar percussion against the city sounds outside my window. "Mom," he said, "I wanted to update you about something. Jennifer and I have been talking to a financial advisor about estate planning, and your name came up." Estate planning, the conversation every aging parent both wants and fears, acknowledgement that death is inevitable, coupled with decisions about how assets and responsibilities will be transferred to the next generation. "What about my name came up?" "Well, we're trying to plan for various scenarios, and we wanted to understand what your situation looks like. Your apartment, any savings you have, what kind of care you might need as you get older." The questions felt invasive, but they were also practical. Adult children do need to understand their aging parents' circumstances to plan appropriately for the future. "I'm not ready to discuss my finances with you," I said. "When I am, I'll bring it up. But Mom, we're trying to be responsible here. If something happens to you, we need to know what we're dealing with. If something happens to me, you'll figure it out. People manage family crises without advanced financial disclosure all the time. That's not very helpful. Michael, for years you've known more about my financial situation than I knew about yours. You've borrowed money without sharing your financial condition, asked for loans without providing documentation of your ability to repay them. Now you want transparency from me that you've never offered in return." The silence suggested he was processing this point. "That's different," he said finally. "You're our parent. Parents help children. That's how it works. And children help parents. That's also how it works, but it needs to be mutual rather than one-directional." "So what are you saying? That you won't tell us anything about your situation?" "I'm saying that when I'm ready to discuss end-of-life planning, I'll initiate that conversation. And when I do, it will be in the context of a relationship where my needs and your needs are given equal consideration." "I don't understand what that means." "It means that if you want to know about my assets, you need to be prepared to share information about yours. If you want input into my care decisions, you need to demonstrate that you value my input into family decisions. If you want me to plan my future around your convenience, you need to show that you consider my convenience when planning your own future." It was a more direct statement of my new boundaries than I'd ever articulated, and I could tell from Michael's response that it challenged his fundamental assumptions about our relationship. "Are you saying that our relationship needs to be transactional?" "I'm saying it needs to be reciprocal. There's a difference." We ended the conversation without resolution, but something had been established. I would not return to one-way giving, no matter how reasonable the request seemed or how guilty refusing made me feel. But the universe has a sense of timing that sometimes feels like cosmic humor. 2 weeks after that conversation, I received news that tested every boundary I'd worked so hard to establish. Michael called on a Tuesday evening, his voice tight with stress and barely controlled panic. "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you not to react until I finish explaining." The preface alone sent my heart racing. The business is in trouble. Serious trouble. There was a problem with a contract, and we're facing a lawsuit that could cost us everything. The house, the cars, the kids' education funds, everything. I sat down heavily in my single chair, feeling the weight of this information settle into my chest like lead. "How serious is serious?" I asked. "We might lose everything. Jennifer's parents are helping with legal fees, but if we lose the lawsuit, we could be looking at bankruptcy. What kind of help do you need from me?" It was the question I'd trained myself to ask instead of immediately offering everything I had. We need money, Mom, a lot of money. Enough to help us relocate if we lose the house, to help with the kids' school continuation, to bridge us until I can rebuild." "How much money?" $50,000. Maybe more. $50,000. More than I had in savings, more than I could borrow against my small apartment, more than I could access without selling everything I owned and moving into subsidized senior housing. "Michael," I said slowly, "I don't have $50,000 to lend you. What about the apartment? You could mortgage it again, or sell it and move in with us." Move in with them. The solution to their crisis that required my complete financial and personal sacrifice. If I mortgage the apartment again, I'll lose it. If I sell it, I'll have nowhere to live except your basement. That's not the worst thing in the world, Mom. Families pull together during emergencies. Families pull together. But what did that mean exactly? Did it mean I should sacrifice my housing security for their financial crisis? Did it mean my stability mattered less than theirs because I was older, because I had less to lose? "Let me think about this," I said. "There's not much time to think. We need to make decisions quickly. Then you need to make decisions that don't require me to give up everything I have." After I hung up, I sat in my small apartment feeling the full weight of this test. Everything I'd learned about boundaries, about reciprocal relationships, about valuing my own needs, all of it was being challenged by this crisis that threatened my grandchildren's stability and my son's future. I called Frances, who was feeling stronger after her most recent chemotherapy treatment. "What would you do?" I asked after explaining the situation. "I'd ask myself some hard questions," she said. "Is this a crisis where family support could make a decisive difference? Or is it a crisis where my sacrifice would just delay the inevitable? Is Michael asking for help to solve a problem, or asking for help to avoid facing the consequences of his choices? I don't know how to tell the difference." Start with information. What exactly happened? What are the legal facts? What are their other options? You can't make good decisions without understanding the real situation. She was right. I'd been trained to respond to family crises with immediate capitulation rather than careful analysis. But this crisis was too large for automatic sacrifice. I called Michael the next day and asked for details he'd never been required to provide before. "I need to understand exactly what happened," I said. "Not the emotional version, but the facts." He was reluctant to provide specifics, which itself was informative. But gradually, I learned that the crisis wasn't entirely unforeseeable. Corners had been cut, contracts had been signed without adequate legal review, insurance coverage had been insufficient to protect against the kind of problem they were facing. "What are Jennifer's parents contributing?" I asked. "They're helping with legal fees." "How much are legal fees?" "About $30,000. "And you need $50,000 from me?" "Maybe more. We won't know until we see how the lawsuit develops." I did some quick mathematics. Jennifer's family was contributing money they could afford to lose. I was being asked to contribute money that would leave me homeless. "Michael," I said, "I'll give you $5,000. It's what I can afford without compromising my housing security." "5,000? Mom, that won't make any difference." "Then you need to find other solutions." "What other solutions? You're my family." "If you won't help me, who will?" Jennifer's parents are helping. You can apply for business loans. You can talk to bankruptcy attorneys about your options. You can sell assets to raise money. We can't sell the house until we know if we're going to lose it anyway. You have 3 expensive cars. You have jewelry, art, electronics. You have assets you can liquidate. Those are just things. My apartment is just a thing too, but it's the thing that keeps me from being homeless. The conversation ended with Michael angry and me exhausted. But I'd held my boundary. I'd offered help I could afford, rather than sacrifice I couldn't survive. Over the following weeks, the family crisis played out in ways that revealed the systematic differences in how various family members were expected to contribute. Jennifer's parents hired the legal team and covered all attorney fees, a contribution of over $40,000 that was presented as generous but manageable. Michael's siblings were asked for emotional support and temporary housing offers, not financial contributions that would threaten their own security. I was the only family member expected to risk my housing stability for their crisis. The $5,000 I contributed was received with disappointment rather than gratitude, as if my refusal to give more proved my lack of love rather than my commitment to survival. But something interesting happened as the legal situation developed. Faced with the need to find solutions that didn't depend on my financial sacrifice, Michael and Jennifer began exploring options they'd dismissed when they assumed I would cover their shortfall. They negotiated payment plans with creditors, downsized some of their lifestyle expenses, researched business insurance claims they'd initially overlooked. The crisis was resolved without my complete financial sacrifice. Not easily, and not without genuine hardship for their family, but it was resolved. They kept their house, their children stayed in their schools, and Michael's business survived in modified form. What didn't survive was their assumption that my resources belonged to them in emergencies. Winter came early that year, and with it a kind of peace I hadn't experienced since Robert died 25 years earlier. My small apartment felt cozy rather than cramped when snow covered the city, and I could watch from my window as people hurried through the streets bundled against the cold. Frances finished her chemotherapy treatments and received clearance from her doctors that her cancer was in remission. We celebrated with dinner at a small Italian restaurant in her neighborhood, toasting survival and friendship and the unexpected gifts that come from learning to value yourself in your 70s. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd gotten sick before I learned to set boundaries, she said over wine and pasta. I would have spent my recovery taking care of other people instead of taking care of myself. Do you think we waited too long to figure this out? I asked. I think we figured it out exactly when we were ready to figure it out. Some lessons can't be learned until you've lived enough life to understand what you're learning. Timothy visited regularly throughout the winter, taking the train down from Westchester to spend Saturday afternoons with me in Manhattan. Our routine included lunch at a diner on Broadway, a walk through Central Park regardless of weather, and conversation that roamed from his college plans to my painting progress, to his observations about family dynamics. Dad's been different since the business crisis, he told me during one visit. Less automatic about things, I guess. What do you mean? Like, he used to just assume that problems would get solved by other people. Now he seems to understand that he has to solve them himself. How do you feel about that change? It's better, I think. More honest. Like, the family was always pretending that Dad was this successful businessman who had everything figured out, but really he was depending on other people to fix his problems. Such wisdom from someone still in high school. Timothy had watched his family's crisis with the clear eyes of someone not yet trained to accept dysfunction as normal. Are you worried about money? I asked. Not really. I mean, things are different now. We don't eat out as much, and Mom doesn't buy clothes as often, but it's not scary different. It's just more realistic different. More realistic. What a concept for a family that had lived beyond their means while expecting others to subsidize their lifestyle. Michael and I settled into a cautious new equilibrium over the winter months. Phone calls were shorter, but more substantive. He started asking about my life, my art classes, my friendships, my activities, rather than just updating me about his family's needs. When he did need something, he asked rather than assumed, and he accepted no without extended argument. It wasn't the warm, close relationship I'd once dreamed of, but it was honest in ways our previous dynamic had never been. The real test came in March, when Michael called with news that should have been unqualified good news. Mom, he said, the legal situation is finally resolved completely. We ended up winning more than we expected, and we're in a position to pay back some of the money we've borrowed over the years. My heart jumped with hope and dread in equal measure. The money he'd borrowed from me, the $50,000 from the apartment mortgage, the various smaller loans that had never been mentioned again, was he finally prepared to acknowledge those debts? That's wonderful news, I said carefully. Yeah, it feels amazing to have that weight off our shoulders. And we wanted to do something special to thank Jennifer's parents for all their help with the legal fees. Jennifer's parents. The people who'd contributed money they could afford to lose were going to be thanked for their help. I held my breath, waiting to hear what acknowledgement would be made of my contribution. We're planning to take them on a cruise to Alaska. They've always wanted to do that, and it seems like the right way to show our appreciation. A cruise to Alaska. I estimated the cost at somewhere around $8,000, more than I'd contributed to their crisis, but less than I'd lost in loans that had never been repaid. That sounds lovely, I said. I'm sure they'll enjoy it. And Mom, we wanted to give you something too. As a thank you for your help. Here it was. The moment that would reveal whether Michael had truly learned to see me as an equal contributor, worthy of equal acknowledgement. We got you a gift certificate for art supplies, he said. $200 to spend at that art store you like on the Upper West Side? $200, compared to an $8,000 cruise for Jennifer's parents. The mathematical ratio told me exactly how my contribution was valued relative to theirs. But something had changed in me over the past year. Instead of feeling hurt or angry, I felt amused. The disparity was so stark, the message so clear, that it had moved beyond painful into the realm of almost comic obviousness. "That's very thoughtful," I said. "I'll enjoy picking out some new paints and brushes." "Great. I'm glad you're pleased." "Michael," I said, "I'm curious about something. Are you planning to address the loans you've received from me over the years?" The silence stretched long enough for me to hear traffic sounds through his phone, suggesting he was driving while we talked. "What loans?" he asked finally. "The $50,000 from my apartment mortgage 2 years ago. The smaller amounts before that. Do you consider those gifts or loans?" "Well, I mean, that was family helping family. I didn't think you expected me to pay that back. Did I say they were gifts?" "Not exactly, but Mom, you know I've been going through a hard time. And now you're not going through a hard time. You just said you won the lawsuit and recovered more than expected, but we have a lot of expenses catching up." "I understand. I also understand that you're spending $8,000 to thank Jennifer's parents and $200 to thank me. That's not a fair comparison." "You're right. It's not fair." I let the silence stretch until he filled it. "What do you want me to do, Mom?" "I want you to decide whether the money you borrowed from me was a loan or a gift. If it was a gift, then thank me appropriately and we'll consider the account settled. If it was a loan, then make arrangements to pay me back. And if I can't do either, then we'll both understand exactly what our relationship is based on." It was the clearest ultimatum I'd ever given my son. Not about money, ultimately, but about recognition. About whether my contributions to his success would be acknowledged or taken for granted. Michael called me back 3 days later. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said. "And you're right. I did borrow money from you and I should pay it back." I felt something ease in my chest that I hadn't realized was tense. "What I can do is pay you back in installments," he continued. $500 a month until the debt is clear. It'll take about 8 years, but at least it's movement in the right direction. $500 a month. It would help with my monthly expenses, allow me to take better care of my health, maybe even save a little for future needs. But more than the money, it represented something I'd never received from Michael before. Recognition that what I'd given him had actual value, that I deserved reciprocal consideration, that our relationship could be built on mutual respect, rather than one-way sacrifice. "That sounds fair," I said. "Thank you, Mom," he said, his voice carrying something I'd rarely heard from him. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see this clearly." An apology. Not a defensive explanation or a justification, but an acknowledgement that his behavior had been problematic and hurtful. "I appreciate that," I said, "and I appreciate the payment plan. Do you think we can build something better between us?" The question that I'd been hoping to hear for years, but which now carried weight, because it came from someone who'd learned to see me as a separate person, worthy of consideration. "I'd like that very much," I said. Spring arrived with cherry blossoms in Central Park, and a sense of renewal that felt both seasonal and personal. The first payment from Michael arrived on schedule, accompanied by a note that simply said, "Thank you for everything, Mom. I'm learning." I deposited the check and used part of it to treat myself to something I'd been wanting for months, a small easel that I could position by my window to catch the best natural light for painting. The rest went into a savings account I'd opened specifically for myself, money that belonged to me rather than being destined for someone else's needs. Frances and I celebrated our birthdays together that spring, hers in April, mine in May, with a weekend trip to a small inn in Vermont where we could paint landscapes and discuss the philosophical implications of learning to love yourself after decades of loving others at your own expense. "Do you ever mourn the relationships we lost by standing up for ourselves?" Frances asked as we painted wildflowers near a stream behind the inn. "Sometimes," I said, "but I think I mourn the relationships I thought we had more than the relationships we actually had." "What do you mean?" "I thought Michael and I had a relationship based on mutual love and respect. But when I stopped sacrificing myself for him, I discovered we really had a relationship based on my usefulness and his entitlement. So what I lost wasn't love. It was a fantasy I'd been maintaining about love. And what are you building instead?" I dabbed blue paint onto my canvas, trying to capture the exact color of the morning sky reflected in the stream. Something real. Something that might be smaller, but it's honest. Timothy graduated from high school that June, and Michael invited me to the ceremony with what felt like genuine pleasure, rather than obligatory inclusion. I sat with the family in folding chairs on the football field. wearing a new dress I'd bought with money from Michael's loan repayment, watching my youngest grandson receive his diploma. After the ceremony, Timothy found me in the crowd and hugged me with the fierce affection of someone who understood that presence was a choice rather than an obligation. "Thank you for coming, Grandma. It means a lot that you're here. I wouldn't have missed it for anything." "I'm going to Colombia in the fall," he said. "It's close enough that I can still visit you regularly." "I'd love that. And Timothy, I'm proud of you. Not just for graduating, but for the person you've become." He smiled with the particular satisfaction of a young person who's been seen and appreciated by someone who matters to them. That afternoon, at the graduation party Michael and Jennifer hosted in their backyard, I was included in conversations rather than assigned to preparation tasks. I was introduced to other parents as Timothy's grandmother, rather than as someone available to help with cleanup. I was offered a chair in the shade and asked about my preferences for food and drinks. Small things, but they represented a seismic shift in how I was perceived and treated within the family dynamic. Jennifer approached me near the end of the party, holding Sophie on her hip while the baby examined everything with the wide-eyed curiosity of someone discovering the world. "Eleanor," she said, "I wanted to apologize for some things. I think I made our relationship more difficult than it needed to be." It was the first direct acknowledgement I'd ever received from her that our relationship had problems, much less that she'd been a significant contributor to those problems. "I appreciate that," I said. "I was protective, I guess, of Michael's attention and resources. I didn't want to share him with anyone, including you. That wasn't fair." "No, it wasn't fair. But I also taught you that I would accept unfair treatment by not standing up for myself sooner. Maybe we could start over? Build something better? I'd like that." Sophie reached toward me with chubby hands, and Jennifer transferred her to my arms without hesitation. The baby settled against me with the trust that small children show before they learn to be cautious, and I felt the particular joy that comes from being welcomed by someone who doesn't yet calculate the value of relationships. That evening, as I drove back to Manhattan through the summer twilight, I reflected on the changes in my life over the past 18 months. Not just the external changes, the boundaries I'd established, the respect I'd demanded, the financial recognition I'd received, but the internal transformation that had made those changes possible. I'd learned to see myself as worthy of consideration rather than grateful for inclusion. I'd discovered that love without respect wasn't really love, and that relationships built on sacrifice rather than reciprocity were ultimately unsustainable. I'd found that standing up for myself didn't destroy my family relationships. It revealed which relationships were strong enough to survive honesty. Most importantly, I'd learned that it's never too late to become the protagonist of your own story. My small apartment welcomed me with its familiar sounds and smells. The radiator's percussion, the faint scent of oil paint from my latest canvases, the particular quality of light that came through my single window as the sun set over Manhattan. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. But it felt different because I was different. I made tea in my old pot and sat by the window watching the city settle into evening. Lights came on in apartments across the courtyard, each one representing lives being lived with whatever combination of joy and struggle, connection and solitude, hope and disappointment that makes up human existence. My life was smaller than I'd once imagined it would be, but it was entirely mine. My relationships were fewer but more genuine. My resources were limited, but not depleted by others' unlimited needs. My future was uncertain, but it was a future I was actively creating, rather than one being determined by other people's expectations. The phone rang, and I checked the caller ID before answering. It was Timothy, calling from his family's house to thank me again for attending his graduation and to tell me about his summer job at the local library. "I told the librarian about your art," he said. "She asked if you'd be interested in displaying some paintings in the community room. They like to feature local artists." A small opportunity, but it filled me with pride and possibility. Someone who didn't know me as anyone's mother or grandmother saw value in something I'd created for my own satisfaction and growth. "I'd love that," I said. "Tell her I'll call tomorrow." After we hung up, I looked at the paintings I'd completed over the past year. Landscapes and still lifes, experiments with color and light, visual records of my journey towards self-discovery and independence. They weren't masterpieces, but they were honest expressions of my own vision and experience. Tomorrow, I would call the librarian and arrange to display my work. I would continue taking classes, building friendships, making choices based on my own interests rather than other people's needs. I would accept Michael's monthly payments as acknowledgement of my value while building a relationship with him based on mutual respect rather than historical obligation. But tonight, I was simply present with myself in my small apartment, surrounded by evidence of the life I was creating at 73 years old. The life I'd earned through decades of sacrifice and service, but which I was finally claiming as my own. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you given so much of yourself that you forgot who you were underneath all that giving? Have you loved people who took your love for granted? Served people who saw your service as their right? If this story feels familiar, I want you to know that it's never too late to remember your own worth. It's never too late to ask for the respect you've earned, to set the boundaries you need, to choose yourself without apology. Your value isn't determined by what you can give to others. Your worth isn't proven by your willingness to sacrifice. You deserve love that doesn't require you to disappear, relationships that don't require you to be less than who you are. Share your story in the comments below. Tell me about the moment you decided to stop begging for love and started demanding respect. And if this message touched something in you, please like this video and subscribe. Together, we can remind each other that we matter, that we're worthy of love and respect, and that it's never too late to become the protagonist of our own story.